Dear Bishop Bonny, honorary rectors, dear Dean Lambrix, colleagues and students, dear participants in the conference. I thank my colleagues Peter de May and Wim François sincerely for inviting me to offer the keynote address at the opening of the 11th Lest Conference, Ecclesia Semper Reformanda, and I thank you, Peter, very much for your kind introduction. The fact that in 2017 the Reformation was commemorated and even celebrated ecumenically throughout the world is by itself a sign for a reform of the self-understanding of the churches and a deep change in the culture of remembrance. All previous centenaries of the Reformation gave rise to sharp polemics between Catholics and Protestants. They mutually accused each other of having fallen into error and heresy, even having lost eternal salvation by leaving the only true church. The 5th centenary in 2017 was and is quite different from these centenaries of the past. In many countries and in many places, the Catholic Church and Protestant churches jointly commemorated 500 years of Reformation, in most cases beyond polemics. This can indeed be called a reformation of our ecclesial memory. 5 or 10 years ago, one could not easily expect that all that what we have seen or will see this year would happen. The situations of the churches commemorating the Reformation are quite different. There are churches in countries whose history was deeply influenced by the events that we call Reformation and their Wirkungsgeschichte, for example, Germany or the Nordic countries. This week, an article was published in a German newspaper by a Finnish author with the title Luther, the Most Important Finn. This funny headline indicates the deep influence of the Lutheran Reformation on Finnish culture. The context for commemorating the Reformation in Finland is quite different from the context, let's say, in São Leopoldo in Brazil, in a predominant Catholic country, or in Tokyo, where all Christians together represent a tiny minority. Notwithstanding these differences, joint Catholic Lutheran commemoration took place or will take place in these countries. This is astonishing if we take into consideration the logic of collective commemoration. At the occasion of anniversaries or centenaries, communities tell publicly where they come from in order to identify who they are or who they wish to be. Since commemorating one's own history is part of one's self-understanding, it also works the other way round, so that a current self-understanding shapes the perception of one's history. Therefore, collective commemoration of history often tells more about how communities see themselves in the present than what their origin and their history have been. Such commemorations may provoke fierce conflicts if questions of legitimacy, for example, of the borders of a country or the political system, are at stake. In order to identify the special challenge of an ecumenical commemoration of the Reformation, we can compare it with a joint commemoration of the history of two nations that were in conflict over centuries, for example, Germany and France. The history of their relation was painful, but two terrible wars in the 20th century convinced both sides that it would be disastrous to continue the old enmity. Since there are no controversial claims anymore that call for certain narratives in order to justify them, historians on both sides have been able to revise old one-sided narratives of the history. Thus, a joint commemoration, for example, of the beginning of World War I was not especially challenging. But commemorating the Reformation is much more difficult. Both the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church see themselves in line with the doctrinal positions that were in conflict in the 16th century. They still make claims to truth for the position that were in conflict at the time of the Reformation. And the split of the Western Church continues to exist and is attributed to the Reformation by most Catholics. How can history go by when the churches claim to be the same now and in the past? Thus, the ecumenical movement has been especially challenged in the preparation for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. 2017 has been a test case for ecumenism. For a long time, many Catholics insisted that 2017 nothing could be celebrated because the Reformation led to the split of the Church, and the split of the Church cannot be celebrated. Lutherans, on the contrary, focused on what they had received from the Lutheran reformers that shaped their churches. They were grateful for it and thus wished to celebrate it. They did not understand their churches as having originated in the Reformation. Rather, they regarded them as the Catholic Church that had gone through the Reformation, and they lamented the split of the Western Church too. The connotations of the word Reformation were so different on both the Catholic and the Lutheran side that a common commemoration, let alone a celebration, seemed to be impossible. The International Lutheran Roman Catholic Commission on Unity discussed these questions for more than 4 years. It turned out to be an obstacle for making progress that most often people use the phrase the Reformation in singular. Even though historians speak of the Wittenberg Reformation, the Zurich Reformation, the Geneva Reformation, the Radical Reformation, the Magisterial Reformation, and so on. Such observations should lead to the insight that Reformation is not an entity well defined in itself. Rather, by using the word, we point to an infinitely complex phenomenon, while the meanings of this word are not simply right or wrong. Rather, they are more or less useful in order to discuss certain aspects of this complex phenomenon. The book From Conflict to Communion, the outcome of that commission's work, has a chapter that offers a historical sketch of the encounters of the Wittenberg movement with Catholic authorities. In this chapter, the word Reformation is understood as a sequence of events, beginning with Luther's 95 Theses on indulgences and leading to the Council of Trent. These events have many subjects and authors, not only Luther and the other reformers, but also cardinals and popes, kings and princes, and the emperor, even the Ottomans. Even though in this chain of events, Luther and his theology played an important role, there were very many other actors involved in the process whose end was the division of the Western Church. Usually, when we use the word Reformation in the singular, we explicitly or implicitly regard the Wittenberg reformers as those to whom this process of the 16th century and its consequences should attribute it. But if we understand Reformation as the sequence of events, its result must attribute it to many actors, And it was this sequence of events that led to the split of the Western Church. In another chapter of From Conflict to Communion, 4 basic aspects of Luther's theology are described. If we have this in mind and call it Reformation, Reformation has a very different meaning from the previous one. The sketch of Luther's theology is presented against the background of the ecumenical dialogues that have addressed the conflict of those aspects of Luther's theology with the Catholic doctrine. Here, in the document, the conflicting truth claims that I mentioned before have been addressed. The ecumenical dialogues claim to have demonstrated that Luther's theology and Catholic doctrine do not mutually exclude each other. Rather, their relationship should be defined in new ways. It was observed that both doctrines use different languages, so that the same words may have different meanings, or they follow different thought structures, so that it is misleading if certain sentences are taken out from their respective system and are simply compared with each other. This was done quite often in history. But if one takes into consideration the differences in language, thought structure, concerns, etc., one is able to identify more common ground between both doctrinal systems than was seen in previous centuries. If Reformation is understood as the ensemble of theological and spiritual insights of the Lutheran reformers, and if ecumenical dialogues have shown that Catholics can share many of these insights, then also Catholics have the possibility to be thankful for the Reformation, understood in this sense, and thus also to celebrate together with Lutherans. With respect to the other meaning or dimension of Reformation, namely the chain of events that led to the split of the Church, both Lutherans and Catholics lament and even confess the sins against unity. The distinction between 2 dimensions of Reformation allows for a differentiated commemoration. It comprises joy and lament, gratitude and confession of shortcomings and failures. The document From Conflict to Communion was the basis for the ecumenical prayer service in Lund in October 31st, 2016, jointly led by Pope Francis and the leaders of the Lutheran World Federation. At the beginning, Pope Francis said in his prayer, "O Holy Spirit, help us to rejoice in the gifts that have come to the Church through the Reformation." He continued, "Prepare us to repent for the dividing walls that we and our forebears have built. And finally, equip us for common witness." The 3 elements of the Pope's prayer reflect the structure of the common prayer, looking back in 2 ways, in thanksgiving and regret, and looking ahead. The churches commit themselves to continue on the journey from conflict to communion. It was highly astonishing that the common prayer started with thanksgiving for the gifts that the Church, in singular, received from the Reformation. What the Church received was explained with a long quotation from Conflict to Communion and brought before God in prayer. This is quite different from the attitude 10 years ago when it was often said, "There is nothing to celebrate in 2017. Looking back in lamentation about and confession of the failures of the past and our own shortcomings, this looking back contained a detailed description of failures of the past and then put into a prayer with 3 steps. First, the lamentation about good reforms that unfortunately had bad consequences, so to speak, a tragic element. Second, the acknowledgement of failures of our forebears. And third, the confession of our own sins. Pope Francis said in this context, "We bring before you the burdens of the guilt of the past, when our forebears did not follow your will, that all be one in the truth of the gospel." This prayer service is remarkable in many respects. It is remarkable from the Lutheran side. The Lutherans did not prepare the central worship service at the beginning of the Reformation here by their own, inviting equally their ecumenical partners, the Reformed, the Anglicans, the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox, Mennonites, Pentecostals. Rather, they prepared this service jointly with the Catholics, while both together invited all the other churches. This is a clear sign that Lutherans take seriously that the Reformers did not wish to create a new church. This service is the Lutheran answer to a sharp question that Cardinal Koch put to the Lutherans, how they see themselves, quote, either as countdown to modern times and the rising star of modernity, insofar as it represented the decisive break with the past, or as a development in fundamental continuity with 1,500 years of Christian church history. The prayer service also was remarkable from the Catholic side. Pope Francis, whose predecessor Leo X had excommunicated Luther as filium in equitatis, went to the Lutheran Cathedral in Lund in order to commemorate together with the Lutherans the Reformation 500 years ago. He was dressed in the same way as the Lutheran leaders, with an alb and a red stole. Red is the liturgical color for the Reformation Day in Lutheran churches, but not the color for October 31st in the Catholic Church. Thus, Pope Francis came into the Lutheran Cathedral with the liturgical color of the Lutheran Church. This is indeed highly remarkable. And thirdly, this prayer service can be seen as the liturgical reception of an ecumenical document from conflict to communion. Many ecumenical documents have never been officially received by the churches. The Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification is an exception. It was received through a complex process of testing and finally approving the document. Lund presented a new way of reception, the liturgical reception of a dialogue document. Ecumenical dialogue paved the way to this common prayer, and this prayer service was the confirmation of the dialogue results. Through television and YouTube, a great number of Christians all over the world participated in the Lund service. In many places of the world, similar services using the Lund liturgy have been celebrated or will be celebrated, also here on Saturday. The booklet From Conflict to Communion has been translated into 15 languages and is studied in many places of the world jointly by Lutherans and Catholics. These are new ways of continued reception of ecumenical documents that deserve special attention. In the second part of my presentation, I will have a look into the future of Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue. I will not do this by offering a picture of a dreamlike future, rather by focusing on a concrete challenge and a concrete response. I will discuss first a challenge that Cardinal Koch has posed to this dialogue, and second, a response to this challenge, the American so-called Declaration on the Way. From the very beginning of his time as president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, Cardinal Koch has emphasized that there is no common understanding of the goal of Catholic Lutheran ecumenism, and he has correctly observed that the different concepts of the unity of the Church depend on the different ecclesiologies of the different churches. Thus, in order to identify a common goal for the ecumenical journey, the Cardinal has constantly admonished that the topic of the understanding of the Church should become the central topic of the dialogue. Even though the Catholic Lutheran Dialog has produced two major ecclesiological documents, namely Church and Justification and the Apostolicity of the Church, the Cardinal assumes a basic ecclesiological difference between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran churches. Nevertheless, he calls for a joint declaration on church and ministry. This is astonishing because if there is such a big gap between the two ecclesiologies, how should a joint declaration be possible, since it first of all should explain what is held in common? Or if the ecumenical dialogues have shown enough commonalities that allow for a joint declaration, can the basic difference be so deep as the Cardinal assumes? I don't know how to answer these questions. In any way, corresponding to the different ecclesiologies, the goal of ecumenism is indeed controversial. On the Protestant side, there is the model of the Leuenberg Fellowship among the Protestant churches in Europe, with the mutual recognition of churches as members of the one body of Christ, and the declaration of altar and pulpit fellowship. The Cardinal is afraid that the Protestant churches might extend this model also to the relations with the Catholic Church, quote, so that there is the underlying implication that we Catholics ought to become Protestants in order to make further progress in ecumenism. But he comes to quote the conclusion that the churches and ecclesial communities originating in the Reformation have abandoned the original ecumenical goal of visible unity and have substituted it with the concept of mutual recognition as churches, which is already feasible. We are faced today with two profoundly different attitudes. On the one hand, there is an ecumenism which continues to seek the visible unity. On the other, there is an ecumenism which considers that what has already been achieved is sufficient and is satisfied in maintaining the status quo, wishing to affirm through the practice of Eucharistic communion and continuing for all the rest to live as separated churches. End quote. Lutherans should take very seriously the Cardinal's criticism that Protestant churches are too easily adapting to the reality of separated churches. Even though the reality of the Leuenberg Fellowship is different from the negative picture that the Cardinal draws, nevertheless, he touches an especially difficult point. But also, the Lutherans have to raise a question to the Cardinal. Which understanding of the visible unity does the Catholic Church have? This seems to be clear, but it is nothing less than clear. The Second Vatican Council recognized elements of sanctification and truth also outside the walls of the Catholic Church, and it recognized that the Holy Spirit does not refrain from using the ecclesial communities outside the Catholic Church as means of grace or salvation. Lutherans are constantly assured that the Catholic Church does not promote return ecumenism. What then is the goal of the Roman Catholic ecumenism if it is not the visible unity? If it is the visible unity but not return ecumenism, which kind of visibility is envisaged? There is no concrete concept from the Catholic side of the ecumenical goal, and one has to say this quite clearly. It does not help to repeat over and over again that the goal is the visible unity, since visible unity can have many different meanings. In a famous talk in Graz in 1976, the then Cardinal Ratzinger stated, quote, "Rome does not need to request from the East more in terms of the doctrine of papacy than was formulated and lived out in the first millennium." If this is the position, it is very different from imposing the dogmas of Vatican I on the Orthodox churches. In that talk, Ratzinger discussed maximalist and minimalist requests to the ecumenical partner. So Lutherans need an answer what Rome is expecting from them on the journey to communion. Lutheran churches on their side should be prepared for reforms in order to deepen and extend the communion with the Roman Catholic Church. But this also applies to the Catholic Church. We cannot see a Catholic model of the ecumenical goal that takes the Lutheran concerns into account. And we need a Lutheran model that takes the Catholics' concerns into account. Only if we find such a model, we can speak of the alternative between a model of searching visible communion or accepting the status quo, as the Cardinal said. This unresolved problem also casts a shadow at an American project about which I would like to speak now. An American Catholic Lutheran task force took up the challenge by Cardinal Koch. They studied the major Catholic Lutheran documents dealing with church ministry and the Eucharist. Finally, they produced a document called Declaration on the Way. It contains 32 agreements on the 3 topics mentioned, a documentation that supports their thesis, and a long section about remaining differences and proposal to overcome them. It is the wish of the task force that the agreements should be studied by the Catholic Church and the Lutheran churches worldwide with the aim of officially receiving them. These agreements do not represent a full consensus, since there are still questions that could not yet be solved. But through the agreements, the declaration intends to identify and summarize all agreed positions that the various dialogues have achieved. The achievements of the dialogues should not get lost, even though the goal of full consensus has not been reached. Ecumenical documents as such have only the authority of the Commission and its arguments. Thus, it is important that the findings of these commissions are officially received by the churches. This is the reason why this declaration, this American project, deserves special attention. Since there is the wish of the American team that the declaration should be discussed worldwide, it may be useful to take into consideration some of the lessons that we learned in the process that led to the official signing of the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification in Augsburg, 1999. When this process began, nobody had any experience how to arrive at a doctrinal agreement between the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church, an agreement that was meant to be officially received by both parties and thus become part of their doctrine. It was not an experiment in the laboratory of ecumenical dialogues and the restricted area of academic research. Rather, it was a large-scale experiment in churches worldwide and partly also in the public space. I would like to identify 4 major lessons that we received. First, searching for greater unity between 2 communities that have been traditionally in conflict with each other often creates disunity within the respective communities. This is a tragic dialectic in looking for peace and reconciliation. A certain number of members of each community are convinced that the separation should continue and that there are no good reasons to move forward overcoming the split. We have experienced this attitude quite often in the political realm when it comes to peacemaking, but we observe it in processes of ecumenical rapprochement too. For as long as people are used to determine their community's identity by opposition to another community, looking for agreements seems to endanger one's identity. The feeling that one's identity is at stake is able to unleash huge polemical energies. Thus, before starting a process of rapprochement or reconciliation, one should carefully evaluate whether the intended goal can actually be reached, or whether the attempt to achieve greater unity would lead to greater disunity. This is not a sign of ecumenical pessimism, rather it takes up Jesus' practical wisdom in Luke 14, quote, "Which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who will see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.'" Second, in most cases, those who are in the position to judge the reception of ecumenical agreements have not been involved in the learning process of the dialogues. Thus, they used to hold positions that were widespread before the dialogues had been undertaken. They feel the task to safeguard the identity of their church's teaching as it was understood for a long time. Short ecumenical text cannot communicate the learning process of the dialogues. Those people react on the basis of their traditional understandings. Thus it should be explored in advance whether their resistance might be overcome, and the documents of agreement should be drafted in a way that anticipates such objections and attempts to respond to them. Third, if churches are asked worldwide to agree with an ecumenical text, they must have the opportunity to propose changes in the text presented to them. Otherwise, they may reject the text only because they disagree with certain sentences, while these sentences could easily be changed or improved. This was also the case with the joint declaration. Through their reactions, the churches changed the first text so that its final version was different from the first draft. It could even be wise to send a draft of the agreement to some churches that are used to make comments on ecumenical text and take up their reactions by revising the draft before the text will be sent officially to the churches. The churches should be able to see themselves becoming the owners of the agreement and not to be those who only have to agree to a text presented to them by others without their own participation. And fourth, It has become clear that the realm of theological education in theological seminaries and university faculties on the one hand, and the realm of ecumenical dialogues on the other hand, have become separated realms. Unfortunately, this is the case. Theological faculties seldom follow the ecumenical debates, with a few laudable exceptions, such as the KU Leuven. But the professors will raise their voices as soon as the process of approving the agreements in the churches will have begun, even though they are mostly unaware of the ecumenical dialogues. Thus, it is important to include theological teachers at an early stage in preliminary informal discussions on the topics of the proposed agreement, in order to ask them for their comments, to take their objections seriously, and to involve them in the whole process. Having these lessons in mind, I would like to address 6 concerns with respect to the declaration on the way. The first is taken from the lesson that churches must have the opportunity to comment on the text with the aim of revising it. At the end of the declaration on the way, there is the recommendation to the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity to, quote, recognize that there are no longer church-dividing differences with respect to these statements. This refers to the 32 statements. This wording creates the impression that it is not foreseen that these 32 statements could be modified. Rather, it is expected that they are approved without changes. I am afraid that this will not work, having in mind the many serious requests to change the first draft of the joint declaration. The Church-wide Assembly of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Ecumenical Commission of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in America have already approved the text. Nevertheless, this should not be an obstacle against opening the discussion on the text. If one indeed wishes that the text is not only received in the US but worldwide, there should be the openness to see the declaration on the way only as a first draft that can be modified. In what follows, I would like to express some further concerns in terms of the status, the form, and the content of the declaration. My second concern refers to the form of the declaration. It is a document of 118 pages, while the recognition that is called for relates only to the 32 agreements containing 6 pages. The fourth section is called Remaining Differences and Reconciling Consideration, 42 pages. It is said that they have a more tentative character. Even though the agreements do not contain differences, nevertheless the churches are asked to, quote, recognize that there are no longer church-dividing differences with respect to these statements. This does not fit together. One would expect such a call for recognition with respect to the section about the remaining differences. With respect to differences, a declaration stating that these differences are not church-dividing would make sense, but not with respect to agreements that have no differences with them. Since the agreements and the differences are in different chapters, it is not quite clear which problems have been solved by addressing the agreements. In my eyes, it is unfortunate that the method of the differentiating consensus has not been chosen, since this method takes up the differences, tries to find out what both sides have in common, describes the commonalities, and explains that and why the differences may remain without denying what is held in common. Since there is a separate section of differences, it is not quite clear whether what is said in the section about the agreements is taken into question by the section with the remaining differences. A third concern. The fourth agreement states, quote, that the church on earth is in every age apostolic, because it is founded upon the apostles' witness to the gospel, and it continuously professes the apostolic and evangelical faith while living by mandated practices handed on from the apostles. Thus, Lutherans and Catholics recognize in both their ecclesial communities the attribute of apostolicity grounded in their ongoing continuity in apostolic faith, teaching and practices. The last sentence is not easy to understand. Does it mean that Catholics and Lutherans mutually recognize the other church's apostolicity? If this is meant, the agreement goes too far, for the study document, the apostolicity of the church, was only able to say that Catholics can recognize certain dimensions of apostolicity in the Lutheran churches. But the declaration seems to have a, so to speak, limited understanding of apostolicity. This understanding can be shared by both Catholics and Lutherans. And with respect to this understanding, Catholics and Lutherans can mutually recognize the other church's apostolicity. But Catholic doctrine has a stronger concept of apostolicity, since it also includes the witnesses to the apostolic tradition, namely the bishops, together with the successor of Peter. They are not mentioned in the agreement's definition of apostolicity. But the challenge of finding an agreement concerning the apostolicity of the Church consists of the different meanings of the word apostolicity and how to find an agreement despite of these differences that shape the institutional structure of the churches. And finally, a fourth concern. A fourth concern. Do Catholics and Lutherans speak about the same in the agreements? So this is quite a difficult question. Now, if a Catholic and a Lutheran reads the agreements about the church, does the word church in both minds refer to the same entity? Both make the same statements about the church, but is it the same reality that is signified by the subject term of the sentence, the word church, in both cases? A Lutheran may think of many different churches that together belong to the whole that he or she calls the body of Christ, while a Catholic may think of the Church of the Creed that subsists in the community governed by bishops in communion with and under the Pope. Is it the same to which both Catholics and Lutherans refer when they make the same sentences with the word church in them? This is not meant as a criticism of the document, rather as a self-critical question. What are we ecumenists doing when we make such a Catholic-Lutheran statement? We should answer this question before we start a broad process of asking for reception of the document. A fifth concern refers to the status of such agreements. The idea of in via declaration was brought up by Harding Meyer, the former director of the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg. He was very much concerned that the results of many dialogues had not been officially received by the churches, and he was afraid that this would lead to a tiredness with respect to dialogues and an unwillingness to look for consensus, in short, to a standstill of the dialogues. Since the dialogues have not achieved a full consensus in several topics, he called for so-called in via declarations that should accomplish three things. A. Define the problem and the way that has gone so far. B. Fix the results that have been achieved so that they can serve as the basis for further dialogues. A basis that should not be put into question again. And C. Indicate the steps that are still needed for full consensus. The problem with this approach is that a doctrinal topic always is a whole, so that isolating certain aspects of it is to a certain degree artificial. Several theologians object that such a procedure leads to a quantitative understanding of doctrinal topoi, regarding them or certain aspects, so to speak, as building blocks. On the other hand, our mind is not able to grasp a complex reality in uno intuitu. Rather, we have to proceed in a discursive way, step by step, element by element. Nevertheless, if one element of a complex reality is missing, the respective entity is not there or in a deficient mode. This makes it so difficult to say what has in fact been achieved if we agree in some elements but not in all of a certain topic. It may turn out that further progress can only be made if we choose a different approach from the previous one, and in this new approach we must rediscuss all elements of a topic. In his book Harvesting the Fruits, Cardinal Kasper describes on many pages what has been jointly said in many dialogues. But when it comes to the remaining questions, only very few pages are needed in order to create the impression that with respect to the remaining hindrances, the progress outlined so extensively is in fact small. I have the impression that on the Catholic side, in evaluating what has been ecumenically achieved, two principles are struggling with each other. On the one hand, in my perspective, on the one hand it is the metaphysical principle, bonum est ex integra causa, malum est ex quocumque defectu. I translate it in a free way, so something good or a breakthrough is only there if all causes are present. But if only one element is missing, all is unsuccessful, or no real progress has been achieved. If your arrow does not hit the mark, you have lost even though you just missed the mark. The other principle is, if you agree on many elements, then you create the expectation that it is not impossible to go ahead even though one or two elements are missing. In this case, you can relativize what is absent or wrong with respect to all that is in common. The last principle has been the ecumenical one, but from the position of church doctrine, the first one seems to be applied when it comes to the question of whether a proposed ecumenical agreement can be approved and received. My last concern is a procedural one. Would the synods and all the other decision-making bodies, now I speak on the Lutheran side, be prepared to enter into a long, challenging and difficult debate on the proposed agreements if they know that even the best possible reactions on their side would not lead to Eucharistic sharing? I am afraid that they will say, why should we spend time even though no change that we can experience will happen as a result? A clear Catholic concept of visible unity would help to identify where the churches would be if they received a declaration on the way and how far the further way would be. But as I said, this concept is missing. In my eyes, the Declaration on the Way is an excellent challenge to take up anew the task of officially receiving ecumenical documents. It is a timely challenge. Looking back at the joint declaration, there was also an initiative from the American Lutheran Church. It indicated that the American Lutherans were prepared to declare a consensus with the Roman Catholic doctrine of grace and justification. This initiative was communicated to the Lutheran World Federation, and it was quickly taken up by the Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. Thus, it was an international project from the beginning. In a similar way, the initiative of the declaration should be taken up, but I expect that many conversations and dialogues will be needed before we can achieve a text that will be a breakthrough in terms of method, content, and procedure. But we should dedicate any effort to this project. If it will succeed, this would be an excellent proof that the churches are indeed ecclesiae reformabiles. Thank you for your attention.